Okay, this is not to knock other friends, but I'm glad you asked this question. Um, it was suggested to you by a parent who did this in another state. And the last thing a parent should ever do is base what they're doing for their children off of the recommendations of other parents it, when it comes to complex things like IDEA services. Okay, I don't know what other state that person lives in. Please understand that every state's a little different in how they implement it. And yes, you're in Alabama, which means that they do the bare minimum with the federal standard, which is what most states do. But those other states, some states do enhance. They do allow more flexibility with regards to access to IDEA funding, even if your child is homeschooled. Okay, so there's some variations out there that may work in a combination for some parents. But in your situation, having them drop out, um, they would still be entitled to services if you decided to get them back in. But the compulsory education would be out of the question. At the same time, we've had multiple cases where the school system says, well, we don't have to let your child enroll. Um, and then we've had to challenge that. Now, technically, they don't have to. Once your child reaches that age, and they drop out, then some of these schools will just say, no, we're not going to let you enroll your child. We don't recognize, because there's not necessarily a right to an education. Now, because your child has an IEP, that is a right until they're 21. But that's a headache. Why do that? I understand paying for a cover school, but if your child is past that age, it's not about dropping out, and it's not about a cover school. You wouldn't have to pay for a cover school if your child was past that age. It just is nothing, because there's no legal requirement after that age. You don't have to formally drop out of anything. You just don't have to meet the state government's requirement to prove that your child is receiving an education somewhere. Um, so I wouldn't recommend doing anything like that. And in fact, I would also say that the requirements of COVID, of what you experienced in the spring, that isn't what the fall is going to look like. It can't look like that. Number one, because schools are going to be open. See, in the spring, it was shut down for everybody. But the school's going to be open with flexible options for parents to continue virtual learning. But you can negotiate sort of an in-between safely. And you may decide at some point during the school year to put them back in, because this is going to go away at some point, guys. And when I say at some point, I think it's going to be fairly quickly. Now, I know some of you were just, clamoring to wait for a vaccine as though that is going to be necessary. I don't think it's going to be necessary. That's me, though. I could be wrong. But with that being said, the one thing that you need to keep in mind is that you're already in a position now to where your children are on the rolls, therefore entitled to a free and appropriate public education. And if you're concerned about the services, then, that's where you need to challenge. But I think I saw where you had written that you're under medical orders, okay, not to send your kids. You don't want to keep them on a teacher's caseload. They can't go to school. Well, you can negotiate that. Just want to make sure that there aren't any reasons I would not want to just drop out if they can't go back. That I wouldn't do that. They're entitled to IDEA services until they're 21. They're both on extended standards. Yes, so is my child. Their entire school program is geared around transition, which is huge. It's important. Um, Also, you're talking about related services, OT, speech language, possible PT. Those things they're still entitled to. Now, if they're not getting the proper amount of those services, because schools tend to really shave those down for high schoolers, which they're not supposed to, guys. The amount of intervention that they're entitled to as a 6-year-old, for example, is going to be the same as a 20-year-old. Now, is it true that schools tend to really overload their services for elementary school, and that's where these professionals tend to be concentrated? Absolutely. True. But at the same time, doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean it's legal. Just means that a lot of parents aren't challenging that. You have no negative feelings toward your school district. Okay, great. You're very pleased with their IEPs and what has been happening at school with regards to educational progress pre-COVID. And you'll be back to that time. Okay? The other thing is this, is if you're under medical orders, they're required to provide your child with a free and appropriate public education. So whatever half-assed thing that they did during the spring, they can't do that in the fall. They've got to come up with something more tangible, something that works. Now, if you're not comfortable having them do some kind of in-service, because of the medical orders, meaning speech, language, or whatever, that doesn't mean that the school system shouldn't be expanding those options to where they're getting their speech language virtually. Okay? There are avenues that they can do that along with the occupational therapy. There's also products out there where it would be more of a benefit to them that the school should pay for, like Gemini. There's a lot of things out there that would help relieve a lot of pressure on you if the school system was a partner with you in helping fund those things and helping have those be resources. But if they're past that time for compulsory education, you don't have to pay the money for a cover school. You just don't. Nobody's going to be asking you if your child's in school or not. So there'd be no need to keep track of that. But what you also need to do is make sure that you're still hooked in with the agencies that provide transition services. And I wouldn't let your school off the hook on the transition service side. That is a very, very important aspect. Supported employment, transitioning over to vocational rehabilitative services. There's also other agencies. Now I know where you live, but there's enough resources down where you live. They could be doing more. And because schools are open, the requirement to provide your children a FAPE is still there. So there's multiple options and combinations that they could come up with in order to fulfill that. And because COVID's temporary in my viewpoint, why make any changes? Don't. Work with your school. If you're worried about, having your kids on their caseload, they're going to be making adjustments of how that even looks. None of us knew what the spring was going to look like. We have a little bit more experience. There has to be some flexible options. And so what would it look like for your children? It could be homebound. But nobody ever said that you had to take a pure virtual option. You just need to figure it out, and you need to be willing to think outside the box with your school on what that would look like, to where your kids are continuing to get some benefit from their remaining eligible time. Okay? I just wouldn't let that go.